In 2029, AT&T is planning to complete one of the most consequential infrastructure decisions in modern American history, and most people have no idea it's happening. By that year, the company plans to eliminate traditional copper-based landline telephone service across nearly all the territory in the United States. Verizon is already well ahead of that curve. Lumen, Frontier, and virtually every other major carrier are moving in the same direction. The landline, the telephone network that connected this country for over a century, is being literally ripped up from the ground. Now, the official story is straightforward. Copper is old. Fiber and wireless are better. Nobody uses landlines anymore, so just move on. But that story leaves out quite a lot. It leaves out the fact that the network being dismantled was specifically engineered to work when everything else failed. When the power goes out, when the storm hits, when you need to call 911 and your cell signal's gone. And the system replacing it? It doesn't have that capability built in. The cost has been quietly moved somewhere else. It leaves out the fact that Americans have already paid in rate increases, in regulatory deals, in direct tax dollars for the fiber optic network that was supposed to replace copper back in the 1990s. The money was collected, billions and billions of dollars. But the network was never fully built, and no one was held accountable. The official story also leaves out the fact that the copper being pulled out from the ground right now, out of the streets and utility poles and the walls of buildings across America, is worth billions of dollars in scrap metal. And the massive brick buildings that once housed the switching equipment for that network, prime downtown real estate, and it's being sold off as we speak. And that official story also leaves out something more fundamental than any of that. The landline was not just a product. It was a product of a specific legal and political bargain, a deal between the government and private industry that said, you will have the exclusive right to own and operate this network, and in exchange, you will serve everyone. You will keep it working, and you will not pick and choose who gets connected. That bargain is being dissolved. And the question this video is going to try to answer is a simple one. Who decided that, and who pays the price? Because the end of the landline is not a technology story. It is a story about public infrastructure, private profit, and what happens when the needs of one overtakes the other. While you weren't looking. In 2015, the FCC under Chairman Wheeler brought up the fact that the telecommunications industry was rolling out IP-based telephone services more and more. Within that context, he then stated that the FCC had the authority under the 1934 Communications Act to approve the discontinuing of copper landlines. Then in 2017, under Chairman Ajit Pai, the FCC released something that has come to be known as the Wireline Infrastructure Order, FCC 17-154. Trust me, it's very good bedtime reading. Within that document, the FCC made it a matter of policy of not just removing the copper lines, but working to expedite their removal. And fast forward to March 5th, 2026. On that date, the FCC issued a public draft of something they called a Network and Services Modernization Order. Basically, they're looking to expedite the removal of copper even faster by doing away with notifications, and even stating that they could override any state-level requirements for maintaining copper lines. The removal of this taxpayer-funded infrastructure has not been put up for a debate, and the FCC is running full steam to rip it out of the ground before people even realize what's happening. So with that being said, I encourage you to share this video to others for awareness, and if you're so inclined, share it with your Congress member, your senator, and anyone that you know that may work for a Congress member or senator. I bet there would be more than a few on Capitol Hill that'd be surprised about this happening. I'm starting the video with the bottom line up front, which was basically the FCC and what they're doing. Now it's time for me to give you the background so that way you have a little bit more understanding. What the old network actually did. To understand what is being lost in the retirement of copper, you have to understand what the old network actually was. Not in nostalgic terms, but in engineering terms. Because the case for retiring it rests almost entirely on the argument that modern alternatives are equivalent or better. And that argument is true in some ways, incomplete in others, and quietly misleading in the ways that matter most. So let's go through it carefully. The first and most important property of the traditional copper telephone network was that it powered itself. When you picked up a corded landline telephone, you were not drawing power from your home's electrical system, you were drawing power from the central office. A low voltage DC current that traveled down the copper wire to your phone. That current came from a bank of batteries at the exchange, backed up by generators. The telephone company maintained that power system. You didn't have to think about it, pay for it separately, or do anything to keep it working. This is not a minor convenience feature. When a hurricane hits, when an ice storm takes down the grid, when a wildfire cuts power to an entire region. Those are exactly the moments when people need to call for help. And those are exactly the moments when the traditional copper landline kept working while everything else around it failed. The system replacing it does not do this. A fiber optic connection to your home terminates in a device called an optical network terminal, a small box on your wall that requires local electrical power to operate. When your power goes out, your fiber-based phone goes out with it, unless you have purchased and maintained a battery backup unit. The FCC has acknowledged this directly. It has required carriers transitioning customers away from copper to offer backup power options. But those options are typically offered at the customer's expense, maintained by the customer, and limited to a few hours of runtime. The obligation that was once built into the network has been transferred to you, and most people don't know it until the storm hits. The second major thing being lost with the removal of the old network was its reliability. The PSTN was engineered to what the industry called 5 nines, 99.999% uptime. That is approximately 5 minutes of unplanned downtime per year. This was achieved through a combination of dedicated circuits, centralized battery backup, hardened physical infrastructure, and a switching architecture designed with redundancy at every level. Central offices in many cities were literally built to survive natural disasters. Some were designed during the Cold War era with nuclear contingency in mind. The infrastructure was not just maintained, it was over-engineered, deliberately, because the people who built it understood that communications network has to be more reliable than the conditions it operates in. IP-based telephone systems, VoIP, internet-based calling, wireless, they operate on a fundamentally different reliability model. They share infrastructure with every other kind of internet traffic. They depend on routers, servers, software stacks, and backhaul connections that were not designed exclusively for voice communication. They are subject to congestion, packet loss, software failures, and cascading outages in ways that the dedicated circuit switch telephone network, the old network, was not. 5 nines is simply not a design target for consumer internet service. The standard is lower, and the failure modes are different, and often less predictable. The third thing that's being lost is what engineers call determinism. When you made a call on the old network, the system either completed it or it didn't. And if it didn't, you got a signal telling you why. It would be a busy tone, something indicating network congestion, a recording. The behavior of the network was predictable and transparent. Packet-switched IP networks are probabilistic by design. Your voice is broken into data packets that travel independently across shared infrastructure and are reassembled at the other end. Under normal conditions, this works well. Under congestion or during network events or emergency, packets get delayed. They arrive out of order, or they even get dropped entirely. The result is jitter or lag, and occasionally completely garbled calls that anyone who uses VoIP regularly has experienced. The fourth aspect that we're losing was basically simplicity and longevity. Copper wire does not run software. It does not need firmware updates. It does not have a 5-year hardware life cycle, after which the manufacturer stops issuing security patches. In numerous instances, copper wire installed in the 1940s was still carrying calls in the 2020s. 80 years of service from the same physical infrastructure. The mechanical switches and analog components of the old network were complex, but their complexity was physical rather than digital, which meant their failure modes were visible, their maintenance was tactile, and their lifespan was measured in decades rather than product cycles. The IP-based systems replacing copper are software dependent in ways that have real and ongoing costs. They require security patching. They require compatibility maintenance as standards evolve. They are targets for cyber attacks in a way that an analog copper line simply was not. The optical network terminal on your wall, the router in your living room, the cloud-based switching infrastructure that handles your calls, all of it lives in a threat environment that did not exist for the old telephone network. The difference is not theoretical. On the morning of September 11, 2001, both systems were tested simultaneously, under conditions no engineer had planned for, and they failed in ways that reveal everything about their underlying architectures. The copper network failed like a road system fails. Where a cable was cut, calls couldn't get through. Where the Verizon central office at 140 West Street was flooded and shuttered by the collapse of the towers, service in Lower Manhattan went dark and stayed dark for days. Those failures had a geography, however. A few blocks from the worst damage, the dial tone still worked. The injury was local, and so was the outage. The cell network didn't fail at a place, it failed at a moment. The moment demand surged, and it failed everywhere at once. As news spread of the events that day, hundreds of millions of Americans reached for their phones simultaneously, and the shared capacity of the wireless network, built for ordinary traffic on an ordinary Tuesday, simply drained. Calls couldn't connect, not because a tower was destroyed, but because everyone was drawing on the same pool at the same time. The failure propagated outward from New York across the entire East Coast. People in cities that had suffered no damage, no destruction, no physical disruption of any kind, could not get a dial tone because the network they depended on was shared with everyone else who was frightened at that same moment. That is a structural difference. A circuit switch network degrades at the point of injury. A shared packet network collapses at the point of maximum need, which is precisely the moment in every disaster and every crisis when the ability to communicate matters most. When you replace that network with one that operates under no equivalent obligation, where the carrier's duty is to provide a commercially reasonable service rather than a universally guaranteed one, you have not just changed the technology, you have changed the terms of the deal. And the public, by and large, was never asked whether they wanted to change those terms. A wire and a promise. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell received a patent for a device that would transmit the human voice over a wire. It was not, at that moment, a network. It was closer to a novelty, a remarkable scientific achievement with no clear commercial shape, at least not yet. The first telephone systems reflected that. If you wanted to speak to your neighbor by telephone in the early days, you actually ran a wire directly to their house. You and your neighbor each had a phone. Those phones could reach each other and nobody else. If you wanted to talk to someone else, you ran another wire. The system was called a full mesh. Every point connected directly to every other point. And it worked fine when there were 2 or 3 phones in a town, but it became completely unworkable as telephone adoption grew. The solution was the central office. Instead of every phone connecting directly to every other phone, every phone connected to a single point, an exchange, and operators at that exchange made the connections. You picked up your phone, told the operator who you wanted to reach, and she or he plugged a cable into a switchboard to connect your line to theirs. The operator was the network. The exchange was the brain. This created something that had not existed before, the local loop. The local loop is the copper wire running from the telephone exchange to your specific address, to your house, your business, your building. It is a dedicated piece of physical infrastructure installed specifically for you, maintained by the telephone company, and carrying your voice in both directions. That local loop, that last stretch of copper wire, is a specific thing being phased out, along with the network that made it function. From these early origins, telephone service spread rapidly, but the system was fragmented. Different companies operated different exchanges. If you were a subscriber on one company's network, you often could not call a subscriber on a competing company's network. The promise of universal communication, the ability to reach anyone anywhere, required something the early competitive market was not producing on its own. It required interconnection. And interconnection, it turned out, eventually involved consolidation. Enter American Telephone and Telegraph Company. AT&T had originally been created in 1885 as a long-distance subsidiary of the Bell telephone system. Its purpose was to build the trunk lines connecting cities. But after Bell's foundational patents expired in 1893 and 1894, the telephone market exploded. Thousands of independent telephone companies formed almost overnight. Bell's market share dropped below 50%. The monopoly that the patents had provided was gone. What replaced it was strategy. AT&T began acquiring competitors wherever it could. More importantly, it controlled the long-distance network, the trunk lines between cities. And if a local independent telephone company wanted its customers to be able to make long-distance calls, it needed access to those trunk lines. That gave AT&T enormous leverage. Interconnection with the national network came with conditions, and those conditions, over time, meant consolidation back toward a single dominant system. But let's pause for a moment to go into that term trunk line. The term comes directly from railroad terminology, where the trunk line was the main intercity route as opposed to the smaller branch lines serving local communities. And of course, this corresponded with the metaphor, the thick central trunk feeding many outward branches. The telegraph industry borrowed it from railroads, and finally telephones borrowed it from telegraphs. Getting back to AT&T's strategy, the intellectual architecture behind all this was built mostly by one man, Theodore Newton Vail. Vail served as the president of AT&T during 2 critical periods, and his philosophy shaped the American telephone system for most of the 20th century. His argument was elegant and, on its surface, seemingly reasonable. Telephone networks, he said, become more valuable the more people are on them. Multiple competing networks that cannot talk to each other are worse for everyone than a single interconnected system. Duplication of infrastructure is wasteful, he said. One national network, universally accessible, reliably maintained, serving everyone. That was the model he was advocating for a communications utility. He summarized this philosophy in a slogan that became the defining statement of the Bell System era: one policy, one system, universal service. It was a marketing phrase. It was also a political argument, and it ended up becoming, more or less, reality. In 1913, facing a serious antitrust case from the Department of Justice, AT&T negotiated a settlement rather than fight a breakup. AT&T's Vice President Nathan Kingsbury sent a letter to the Attorney General offering 3 concessions. First, AT&T would allow independent telephone companies to interconnect with its long-distance network. Second, it would stop acquiring competing companies without government approval. And third, it would divest its controlling interest in Western Union, the dominant telegraph company. In exchange, the government dropped the antitrust action. That agreement, known ever since as the Kingsbury Commitment, was the moment the American telephone monopoly became semi-official. AT&T kept its dominant position. In exchange, the government got regulatory oversight and interconnection obligations. The public got what Vail promised: one system, universally accessible. It is worth pausing here to understand what was actually being traded. The Kingsbury Commitment was not just a business deal. It was the moment the telephone network was formally recognized as something closer to public infrastructure than a private product. The government was not merely allowing AT&T to be big, it was extending to AT&T the political legitimacy of a utility, the kind of institution that exists to serve the public rather than simply to profit from it. That legitimacy came with obligations. In 1934, Congress passed the Communications Act, which created the Federal Communications Commission and formally established the legal framework for the telephone network as a common carrier. Under that framework, telephone companies had a duty to furnish communication service on reasonable request. They were prohibited from discriminating between customers. They could not decide whose call went through and whose did not. Their job, their legal job, was to connect communications, not to evaluate them, not to filter them, not to sit in judgment over them. The network's job was to complete the call. That was it. One system to rule them all. By the middle of the 20th century, the Bell System was one of the largest corporations in the history of the world. AT&T controlled roughly 80 to 90% of all telephone services in the United States. It owned the long-distance network. It owned Western Electric, the manufacturing arm that produced virtually all the telephones, as well as the switches and the cables used in the system. It owned Bell Telephone Laboratories, one of the most consequential industrial research institutions ever created, the place where the transistor, the laser, information theory, and the Unix operating system were all born. And through the regional Bell operating companies, it controlled local telephone service in most of the country. This was not a company that happened to be large. It was a company that had been deliberately structured, with government knowledge and government acceptance, to be the singular nervous system of American communication. A term for it started to be used, sometimes derisively, sometimes with affection. It became known as Ma Bell, as in Mother Bell, since it was acting like a strict parent over all the various entities acting within its network. The network was expected to be available essentially always, and it was built to deliver on that expectation. The network was engineered to be independent of local commercial power because the people who built it understood that the moments when you most needed a telephone were often the same moments when everything else stopped working. This was no accident, it was a philosophy. The legal framework supporting all of this was the Communications Act of 1934. It is worth spending a moment on what that law actually established, because it is frequently mischaracterized in both directions, either romanticized as a perfect guarantee or dismissed as an outdated regulatory relic. What the 1934 Act did was restructure the common carrier model for the telephone network, which had been designated as a common carrier in law since 1910. A common carrier in legal terms is an entity that holds itself out to serve the general public without discrimination. Railroads were common carriers. Shipping companies were common carriers. And under the 1934 Act, telephone companies were designated common carriers. That meant they had an obligation, a legal duty, to furnish communication services. You called, they connected you. That was the deal. The Act also contained Section 605, which broadly prohibited the unauthorized interception and divulgence of wire communications. This was not a small thing. It meant that the network carried your voice, and the network did not listen to it, did not evaluate it, did not share it. The telephone company's job was transportation, not surveillance. Your conversation belonged to you. This matters enormously for understanding what is being lost in the current transition, and it matters in ways that go beyond the landline itself. The principle of neutral carriage of a network whose job is completion rather than evaluation is the ancestor of every subsequent debate about network neutrality, about call filtering, about who gets to decide whether your communication reaches its destination. The 1934 framework did not create a perfect system, but it did create a system organized around that specific obligation, and that obligation shaped American communication law for decades. Under this framework, through the middle decades of the 20th century, telephone service expanded dramatically. Rural areas got connected, suburbs got connected, the dial replaced the operator for local calls, then for long-distance calls. Automatic switching systems replaced the manual switchboard. The network grew more sophisticated while remaining, at its core, the same thing it had always been, a system whose purpose was to put line A in contact with line B. The Bell system also began, quietly, the technological transition that would eventually lead to the move away from copper. In the 1960s, engineers began converting the core of the network from analog to digital. Rather than transmitting your voice as a continuous electrical wave, the new technology, called pulse code modulation, converted it into a stream of ones and zeros. But this initial digitization did not replace copper. The digital signals still traveled over the same copper wire infrastructure that had carried analog signals for decades. What changed was the encoding, not the medium. The network had become digital before it became fiber. It was not until the 1980s that the long-distance trunk lines between cities began to be converted to fiber optic cable, which carried signals as pulses of light rather than electrical current and could handle vastly more traffic. These were two distinct transitions separated by roughly 2 decades. First, the signal changed, and then the wire. This made the network more efficient and the call quality more consistent. By the 1980s, the long-distance trunk lines between cities were being converted from copper to fiber optic cable. But notice what did not change. The local loop, that copper wire running from the central office to your front door, stayed copper. The last mile, as engineers called it, remained the same physical infrastructure it had been for decades. Fiber transformed the backbone of the network. Copper remained the connection to the home. This distinction matters because it is precisely that last stretch of copper, that local loop, the thing that powered your phone from the line, the thing that kept working during the blackout, that is being retired today.